A medieval castle. In our imagination, it is a symbol of indestructible power, chivalric romance, and royal luxury. Tall towers, thick walls, flags flying in the wind. But what if we told you that behind this majestic facade was a reality full of hardship, cold, disease, and a constant, grueling struggle for survival? What if this stone fortress, built to protect against enemies from the outside, was itself becoming an enemy to those who lived inside? We are not talking about battles and sieges. We're talking about everyday life. We are talking about how to survive when the icy cold chills penetrate to the bone in winter and the stifling dampness reigns in summer. How not to die of hunger when supplies are running low, or of disease when hygiene and medicine are in their infancy. Life in the castle was not a fairy tale, but a real mystery that had to be solved every day. Do you think the life of a lord and his family was a holiday? What about the hundreds of servants, soldiers, and artisans who inhabited the castle? What did they eat? How did they escape the cold? What did they dream about in their dark, damp cells? The mystery of survival in a medieval castle is not a story about kings and queens. It is a story about human resilience, ingenuity, and the ability to adapt to conditions that would seem unbearable to us today. Stay with us to the end, and you'll learn why stone walls were not only a defense, but also a curse. How huge halls were turned into ice traps. What invisible enemies, in addition to the cold, lurked the castle's inhabitants. And what simple but ingenious tricks helped people survive in these stone giants. This is an immersion into the real, unadorned life of the Middle Ages. Stone is the foundation of the castle, its essence and its strength. It does not burn, does not rot, does not succumb to battering rams and arrows. Stone walls several meters thick were a reliable shield protecting from enemy armies. But this same stone, this silent guardian, with the onset of cold weather turned into a ruthless internal enemy, and in summer, a source of dampness and mold. This was the main paradox of castle life. In winter, the stone worked like a giant cold accumulator. Slowly freezing in the fall, it then exuded its chilling breath inside the rooms for weeks and months. Even if the fire roared in the huge fireplace day and night, its heat was only enough for a few meters around. If you stepped aside, you fell into the embrace of the cold. The air inside the rooms was so cold that your breath turned into clouds of vapor, and in the corners, away from the fire, frost could form on the stones. It was a winter that had penetrated inside, from which there was no hiding. Leaning against such a wall was like touching a block of ice. People were sick and dying not only from swords, but also from pneumonia earned by sleeping against the cold wall. In summer, however, stone created another problem: dampness. In rainy weather, it absorbed moisture like a sponge and then slowly released it inside, creating a dank atmosphere in the rooms. The sun's rays hardly warmed the walls, so the castle was often dark and damp. Mold appeared on the walls, the wooden beams rotted, and the air became heavy and unhealthy, promoting disease. The smell of mold and mildew, mixed with the smoke from the hearth, became a constant backdrop to life. Clothes left against the wall became damp to the touch. Leather harnesses were covered with a green patina, and metal armor required constant cleaning from rust. Chronic joint pains, rheumatism, and constant coughing were all direct consequences of living in the perpetual dampness that made the castle an unhealthy, depressing place. This constant struggle with a hostile environment also had a profound psychological impact. Living in semi-darkness, in cold and damp walls, where the sun was a rare guest, could not but affect the state of mind. The feeling of being trapped in a stone tomb was pressurizing, depressing, and apathetic. Survival was not only a physical challenge, but also a mental one. It required a tremendous inner effort not to succumb to the oppressive atmosphere and to keep the will to live. To combat this, the walls were draped. In the rooms of the nobility, these were expensive tapestries depicting hunting scenes or biblical stories. In simpler rooms, they were rough woolen cloth, felt, or even animal skins. These draperies were not so much an ornament as a necessity of life. They created a layer of air that insulated at least a little from the cold and dampness of the stone. But it was only a half measure. The inhabitants of the castle were trapped in a stone bag that protected them from the world. but at the same time oppressed them with its unchanging, cold power. The heart of every castle was the Great Hall, a vast, humming, high-ceiling room where a lord received his vassals, held court, feasted, and displayed his power. It was a place of power, grandeur, and publicity. But with the onset of winter, this symbol of power turned into its opposite, a giant stone trap sucking out heat and vitality. It was almost impossible to heat such a colossal volume of air with one or even several hearths. All the heat escaped rapidly upward to the unheated beams and rafters, leaving the people below shivering with cold. Huge windows, often without panes, let in a minimum of light but a maximum of icy drafts. The stone floor breathed cold from the ground itself. The fire, even the biggest one, gave warmth only within a radius of a few meters. People huddled around the fire, but their backs were freezing and their heads were still cold. Later fireplaces with chimneys appeared, but they did not solve the problem dramatically. The fireplace heated directionally, leaving the corners of the hall at the mercy of frost and dampness. In early castles with a central hearth without a chimney, the problem was exacerbated by smoke. All the smoke rose to the ceiling, covering the wooden beams and rafters with a thick, greasy layer of black soot, which sometimes fell down in flakes. The air in the hall was heavy and musty, and the constant odor of smoke permeated clothing, tapestries, and the people themselves, causing coughing and respiratory illness. Chroniclers of the time describe how ladies at feasts sat wrapped in several layers of furs, and ink froze in the inkwells. Therefore, daily life in the Great Hall was at a standstill during the winter. It was used only for the most important ceremonies, and for living, people looked for other solutions. Inside the hall, they created rooms within rooms, using heavy tapestries, screens, wooden partitions. They created small enclosed spaces that were easier to heat. Tables and beds were placed in these cocoons, where all life took place. The floor was no less of a problem. In order to insulate the floor from the icy stone, it was covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds. However, this bedding quickly turned into a breeding ground for unsanitary conditions. It accumulated food scraps, spilled beer and wine, bones thrown to the dogs, and other garbage. It was seldom completely replaced, more often just a new, fresh layer on top. As a result, there was a stale, sour odor of rotting organic matter, mixed with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Greatness became a burden. What should have been impressive and overwhelming in size became a source of discomfort and disease. Even the fire itself had its own strict hierarchy. The best, warmest seats were occupied by the Lord, his family, and honored guests. The others were further out, on the periphery of the warmth, where they received only the drafts and the cold breath of the stone. The riddle of surviving in the Great Hall was to learn to ignore it, to shut out its emptiness and cold, to create their own small, fragile islands of warmth in the midst of this ocean of stone. People did not live in the hall, but in spite of it. In addition to the obvious enemy, cold, the inhabitants of a medieval castle faced other, less visible, but no less dangerous threats. These were drafts, dampness, lack of hygiene, and as a consequence, the constant risk of disease. The castle was not only a fortress, but also a breeding ground for infections, where survival depended not only on strength, but also on immunity. The castles were full of drafts. The wind blew through long corridors, spiral staircases, poorly fitted doors, and unglazed windows. These constant streams of cold air were not just unpleasant, they caused colds, rheumatism, and other diseases. Fighting drafts was a daily routine. Cracks were plugged with moss and rags, and heavy drapes were hung on the doors. The dampness we have already mentioned was another problem. It soaked not only the walls, but also clothes, bedding, and food supplies. The dampness was a perfect breeding ground for mold, which could cause allergies and lung diseases. Wooden floors and furniture rotted, and the air became heavy and musty. To combat this, the floors were covered with straw or reeds, which absorbed moisture, but they had to be changed often, or they became a source of rot and odor. Sanitary conditions in castles were appalling by modern standards. Toilets, check rooms, were simply niches in the wall with a hole going out. All the filth would fall down into the moat or just to the foot of the wall, creating a hotbed of unsanitary conditions. Kitchen waste and other garbage was also often thrown directly into the courtyard or moat. This was especially dangerous if the castle's main well, the source of drinking water, was nearby. As the sewage seeped through the soil, it could easily poison the water, turning the only source of life during a siege into a source of slow death from disease. The defenders of the castle could literally drink the poison they themselves produced. All this, combined with the crowded population, hundreds of people and animals lived in the castle, created ideal conditions for the breeding of rats, fleas, lice, and the spread of infectious diseases, from dysentery and typhus to smallpox and plague. The rats were not just plague carriers. They destroyed precious grain reserves in the barns, condemning the garrison to starvation. Lice and fleas were constant, distressing companions, impossible to get rid of. They caused unbearable itching, skin infections, and carried typhus. Add to this the domestic animals, dogs, chickens, and sometimes pigs, that lived side by side with people and left their feces everywhere. All this created a disgusting, stinky microcosm teeming with invisible threats. In the absence of knowledge of germs and effective medicines, any scratch could lead to blood poisoning, and simple diarrhea could lead to death from dehydration. An epidemic in a castle that was hard to escape from could wipe out most of its inhabitants. Survival in such conditions was a lottery. When external protection in the form of walls and roofs failed, the main fortress for a man became his own clothes and bed. In a medieval castle, these were not items of fashion or comfort, but vital elements of survival, a real multi-layered armor that protected not from swords but from cold, damp, and drafts. The principle of layering was the key to everything. First, an undershirt made of linen was put on the body. On top of that, one or more tunics made of wool. Wool was the main salvation. It retained heat perfectly, even when wet. Heavy cloaks, often with hoods, also made of dense wool or felt, served as outer clothing. The nobility could have fur-lined cloaks, which was not only a sign of status, but also an excellent insulator. They slept in their clothes too. To be undressed in a cold, damp room was almost certain to make you sick. The bed was not just a place to sleep, but a real refuge. The nobility had massive wooden beds on a catwalk to distance themselves from the cold stone floor. But the main element was the canopy with dense curtains of heavy fabric that covered the bed from all sides, creating a kind of warm tent. Inside this tent, the warmth from the bodies of the sleepers was retained much longer. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, wool, or down. They covered themselves with several layers of blankets made of wool, scraps, and the warmest layer was often an animal skin. For additional heating, stones heated by the hearth and wrapped in cloth or special ceramic warmers with hot coals were placed in the bed. The simple inhabitants of the castle, servants, soldiers, slept on straw mattresses spread on the floor or on wooden bunks. They covered themselves with their cloaks and often slept huddled close together for warmth. This principle of social warmth was one of the most important survival strategies. Children slept with their parents, servants slept with 2 or 3 of them. Even a dog was often let into bed. It was an excellent warming pad. In conditions of constant cold and hard physical labor, food for the castle inhabitants was not a pleasure, but first of all, a fuel that had to warm from within and give energy for life. The winter ration was simple, hearty, and most importantly, hot. Aesthetics and refinements took a back seat to the urgent need to survive. The diet of most of the castle's inhabitants, from soldiers to servants, was based on cereals. Thick, rich porridge made of barley, oats or spelt, pulse, boiled with water or, at best, with meat broth, was the daily food. Everything that was at hand was added to them. Root vegetables, cabbage, legumes, onions, garlic. Such hot, dense porridge was digested for a long time, giving a feeling of satiety and warmth. Bread was also an integral part of the diet. It was coarse, dark, but hearty. It was eaten with chowder, with cheese, or simply dipped in sauce. Hot soups and stews based on vegetables, legumes, and, if you were lucky, meat or fish, were a must during the cold season. A bowl of steaming chowder warmed not only the stomach, but also chilled hands. For the nobility, of course, the menu was more varied. Meat appeared on their tables: game, beef, pork, poultry. But even for them, the winter cuisine was more fatty and dense. Many spices were used: pepper, cloves, ginger, cinnamon, which were believed to warm the blood. Hot drinks were popular, such as heated wine with spices and honey, medieval mulled wine. Preservation played a huge role. In summer and fall, they prepared everything that could be preserved: salted and smoked meat and fish, dried mushrooms, fruits, vegetables, sauerkraut. These stocks were the key to survival in winter, when fresh food was unavailable. The castle's ability to survive not only the winter but also a possible siege depended on how richly stocked the castle's storerooms were. In the cold stone castle, fire was synonymous with life, but access to this main source of heat and light was strictly hierarchized. Fire was not a right but a privilege, and its distribution clearly demonstrated the social structure of the castle society. The higher your status, the closer you were to the fire. Fireplaces were the main source of heat for the elite. They appeared in castles from the 13th centuries and were a real technological breakthrough. A fireplace not only gave heat, but unlike an open hearth, also diverted smoke outside through a chimney. However, fireplaces were expensive to build and were not available in all rooms. Usually there was a fireplace in the Great Hall, in the private chambers of lords and ladies, and sometimes in guest rooms. Even the largest fireplace heated only the limited space in front of it. Massive armchairs with high backs were placed by the fire to protect against drafts. Here by the fireplace, the life of the nobility took place in winter. They ate, read, and talked. But as soon as they stepped a few steps away, the temperature plummeted. Most of the castle's rooms, servants' quarters, soldiers' barracks, corridors, storerooms, did not have fireplaces. Their inhabitants had to make do with more primitive and dangerous sources of heat. These were portable braziers, metal or ceramic bowls with glowing coals. They were placed in the middle of the room, but they provided little heat and posed a serious threat. First, they were a fire hazard. A spark could easily ignite the straw on the floor or wooden furniture. Secondly, and this was the worst of all, smoldering coals in a closed room emitted carbon monoxide, a silent killer without color or smell. Cases of carbon monoxide poisoning were not uncommon. The kitchen, with its large hearths, was one of the warmest places in the castle, and servants often tried to spend as much time there as possible, warming themselves by the fire. Thus, there was a veritable geography of warmth in the castle. There were warm, privileged zones for the elite and vast cold spaces for everyone else. Survival for the common castle dweller often meant being able to find access to fire, in the kitchen, in the forge, or simply huddling with companions to warm themselves with their own body heat. Providing the castle with water and waste disposal were among the most difficult engineering and domestic tasks, and the health and survival of all its inhabitants directly depended on their solution. This side of castle life rarely makes it into chivalric novels, but it was a harsh day-to-day reality. Water was brought to the castle in various ways. The ideal was a well dug inside the castle walls. This provided access to water even during a siege. The depth of such wells could reach tens of meters. Raising water was hard physical labor. If it was impossible to dig a well, cisterns were built to collect rainwater, but such water was not of the best quality. Some castles located near rivers or lakes may have used more sophisticated systems to raise water, but in any case, water was a precious resource, and it was used sparingly. It was used for drinking, often diluted with wine for disinfection, cooking, and in minimal quantities for washing. Bathing as we understand it was out of the question for most of the castle's inhabitants. Waste disposal was an even bigger problem. The main element of the castle's sewerage were garderobes, toilets built in niches in the walls. They consisted of a stone seat with a hole that led into a vertical shaft. All sewage fell downwards, either into the castle moat or simply to the foot of the wall. One can imagine the odor around the castle, especially in summer. These accumulations of waste were a breeding ground for flies, rats, and infections. In the ditch where the sewage was dumped, the water was undrinkable and a stinking sludge. Kitchen waste, garbage, and animal droppings were also often thrown into the courtyard or moat. Not surprisingly, in such unsanitary conditions, outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other intestinal infections were commonplace. The puzzle of survival in the castle was not only how to defend oneself against the enemy, but also how not to die from diseases generated by one's own waste products. It was a constant, invisible war with germs, in which immunity and luck played no less a role than the strength of the walls. Modern man is used to light being available at any time of day, at the flick of a switch. In a medieval castle, things were different. With the setting of the sun, life was plunged into semi-darkness, or even total darkness. Artificial lighting was expensive, dim, and fire hazardous, and it radically changed the rhythm of life and the life of the castle's inhabitants. Wax candles were the main source of light for the nobility. They gave an even, bright light and smelled pleasant, but were very expensive, as beeswax was a valuable product. Candles were measured by weight and used very sparingly, even in a lord's chambers. They were set in expensive candelabras and candlesticks made of metal or ceramic. Most of the castle's inhabitants, servants, soldiers, artisans, used cheaper sources of light. These were tallow candles made from animal fat. They burned unevenly, smoked heavily, spreading an unpleasant odor, and had to be constantly corrected. But they were much more affordable than wax candles. Another common way of lighting was oil lamps, small clay or metal vessels in which vegetable oil, most often olive or linseed oil, was poured and a wick was inserted. They gave more light than tallow candles, but oil was also a valuable product. In the poorest rooms could use just tapers, long thin slivers of dry wood that burned quickly and needed constant replacement. The lack of light drastically changed the way of life. When darkness fell, most active activities ceased. People gathered together around a hearth or fireplace where there was at least some light and warmth. It was a time for telling stories, singing songs, praying, or just socializing. Work requiring good light, such as embroidery or reading, for the few who were literate, was only possible during the day by the window or in the evening by the light of an expensive candle. The darkness was also dangerous. Moving through the dark, unfamiliar corridors and spiral staircases of the castle at night without a source of light was risky. One could easily stumble and get injured. The darkness created an oppressive and sometimes frightening atmosphere, giving rise to superstitions and fears. Survival in the castle was also survival in almost constant darkness, where every light was worth its weight in gold. All the difficulties and hardships of everyday life in the castle were multiplied during a siege. When the enemy army surrounded the castle, it turned from a fortress into a prison, and the survival of its inhabitants depended on the strength of the walls, the courage of the defenders, and most importantly, the amount of supplies. The siege was the ultimate test of strength for everyone, from the lord to the last servant. The main problem during the siege was hunger. Food supplies, grain, corned beef, dried vegetables, were limited. The siege could last for months, and rations had to be constantly cut back. First, all domestic animals were eaten, including horses, dogs, and cats. Then rats, leather belts, and grass growing on the walls were used. Hunger was more terrible than any enemy weapon. It broke the will and led to disease. Water was also becoming a problem. If the castle had a reliable well, it was a great advantage. But the enemy could try to poison it by throwing animal or human corpses into it. Rainwater cisterns were quickly depleted. The lack of water was even more painful than hunger. The siege was also a huge psychological test. The constant fear of the assault, the rumbling of the siege machines, the screams of the enemy, the sight of dead and wounded comrades, all this got on the nerves. People lived in a state of constant tension, overcrowding, and unsanitary conditions. Epidemics in the besieged castle broke out very easily and claimed many lives. The defenders of the castle suffered heavy losses not only during the assaults, but also from enemy fire. Huge stones fired by catapults crushed walls and roofs, burying people under the debris. Incendiary arrows caused fires. The morale of the defenders fell with every day of the siege. Hope for outside help was fading. Surviving in a besieged castle required incredible fortitude, discipline, and mutual support. Everyone had a role to play: soldiers to fight on the walls, women to care for the wounded, artisans to repair weapons and fortifications. It was a common misfortune that either united people or led to internal strife and betrayal. The outcome of a siege was often decided not by force of arms, but by who would run out of food, water, or will to resist. Despite all the difficulties, people have lived and survived in castles for centuries. This would not have been possible without the many architectural tricks incorporated during construction and the daily ingenuity of the inhabitants themselves. Survival was an art made up of many small but important details. The architecture of castles was thought out not only from a military, but also from a practical point of view. Spiral staircases, for example, not only made it difficult for enemies to climb, but also slowed down drafts. Narrow corridors and numerous doors also helped to combat cold air currents. The location of the kitchen on the lower floors allowed the heat from the hearths to rise up and warm the upper rooms at least a little. The battlements were not only defensive elements but also sources of ventilation, although they created drafts. Courtyards provided access of light and air to the central part of the castle. Thick walls, as we have already mentioned, not only protected, but also had great thermal inertia. Slowly heating up and slowly cooling down, they smoothed out sharp temperature changes. But the main thing was the everyday ingenuity of the people themselves. They learned to maximize the use of all available resources. Any fabric was used to insulate walls or plug cracks. Any leftovers were used to make stews. Animal fat was collected to make tallow candles. The ashes from the hearth were used as fertilizer for small gardens inside the walls or as a detergent. People learned to live in a collective, helping each other. Cooking together, caring for children, mending clothes and utensils were all part of a common survival strategy. It was difficult to survive alone in the castle. Mutual help, trust, and a sense of elbow were as important as a sword or shield. Even the entertainment was simple, but it helped to distract from the hardships of life. They were games of dice, checkers, telling stories, singing songs, playing simple musical instruments. These small pleasures helped to preserve the human form in harsh conditions. Castle Survival Mystery is not only a story about fighting cold and hunger, but also a story about the strength of the human spirit, its ability to adapt, create, and find hope even within the bleakest of walls. The medieval castle, as we have seen, was not a fairy tale palace, but a harsh, dangerous, and deprived environment. Its stone walls, meant to protect, often became a source of cold and disease. Its grandeur turned to discomfort and its safety to isolation. Surviving within these walls was a daily challenge, a true mystery that each of its inhabitants had to solve. People survived not because of luxury, but in spite of its absence. They survived because of their ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability. They learned to fight drafts with heavy tapestries, to warm each other in cold rooms, to turn scarce food into a source of energy and darkness into part of their everyday life. It was a life full of compromise, but also full of strength. The story of survival in medieval castles is a reminder that behind the grand facades of history, there is always the everyday life of ordinary people, with their fears, hopes, and little tricks. This is a story about the fact that a real fortress is not stone and not towers, but the human spirit that can withstand in any, even the most unbearable conditions. If you are interested in this journey into the harsh reality of a medieval castle, and you want to learn more about how people really lived in the past, put a like and be sure to subscribe to our channel.